Welcome to the Noble Ape podcast, Ape Reality. I'm Tom Barbley, and yes, it has been an awfully long time since the last Ape Reality. I've got to give some apology with regards to that. Obviously, there has been some productive stuff going on. I guess my podcasting time just hasn't been the same, really, since I went to the Bay Area and came back. That being said, I am actually recording a new podcast with a fellow called Heron Stone. What I anticipate doing is putting a couple of those podcasts in the Ape Reality feed just after this podcast. So if folks are interested in the new podcast, you can download a couple of sample episodes and get a sense of what we talk about, and then if you like it, subscribe. But the real purpose of that podcast is not really to continue any kind of artificial life-related discussion. It's more to, I guess, create some format for discourse, or forum for discourse, more importantly. And the anticipation is to have a number of other folk participating, a number of people other than just Heron and myself, but initially just to kick off the podcast format. Heron and I guess, have had 8 recorded discussions already, including a number of things that relate to Noble Ape in passing, and certainly some discussion associated with my time in the Bay Area recently. But to give some updates, the Biota podcast relating to the talk at Stanford Research is probably quite complimentary here as well, because it certainly gives some discussion associated with Bob Mottram's changes. There have obviously been a very substantial number of changes introduced by Bob Mottram in the past 2.5 months, including a number that have really changed the direction of the Noble Ape simulation in terms of the simulation core, obviously a wide variety of genetics, familial interactions, different kinds of relationships, what I'm calling Ape Book, which is the social graph component, just a number of technologies I've already discussed both at the Intel talk and the SRI talk, so I won't dwell too long on Bob's changes, except to say that they are very substantial and have resulted in quite a considerable rewrite of the simulation. My hope is actually to release this new version of the simulation hopefully in the next couple of weeks. I do have a few other things that I'm working on currently, including a book chapter for the never-ending set of book chapters. But I would like to get a version of the Noble Ape simulation out relatively shortly, just to capture Bob's recent changes. And also, per the Intel and SRI talks, the resolution of the landscape in the Noble Ape simulation has now changed to 512 by 512. I was aiming for 1024 by 1024. However, it will require a new means of actually viewing the landscape, viewing the map in particular, probably some zoom and scrolling functionality, just because the existing landscape really, well, for my Mac in particular, I can't get the 1024 by 1024 map on the screen. It just doesn't have the resolution with the monitor. So it will need some kind of zoom in move feature in order to get that stuff looking right. So that's coming up in the near future. A few minor changes on my end, but obviously Bob has just been running from strength to strength. Some slight kind of editorial discussion associated with my time in the Bay Area. I spent basically just under half a day at Intel, met a wide variety of their engineers there. It was really quite an interesting experience, and certainly got a sense of what Intel might be using for the Noble Ape simulation for in the near future. And then spent only half an hour at Apple with Ernie Probakar the following day and talked to him about a number of different technologies. The main feedback he gave me, aside from a kind of wish list of things that he'd like to see in Noble Ape in the near future, is the addition of a development blog. And I've done that with regards to Noble Ape simulation, nobleape.com/ I want to say blog even, yes, nobleape.com/blog. Welcome to my my general cognitive framework. And that will give a kind of developer blog update when new features are added. And I think certainly this new release will contain a substantial developer blog entry for it. But that's just a way of, I guess, providing an RSS feed, or at least some serialized way that folks can follow the Noble Ape development. Although, having said that, I don't actually think there's an RSS feed that comes off the blog currently. It is just a WordPress blog, however, so I'm sure that's a standard format. I also spent an afternoon with Jeffrey Ventrella, which was really quite nice. One of these luxuries of actually spending time with people on location. But to editorialize this briefly, both the Intel talk and the SRI talk in particular, wasn't particularly well attended. It was quality over quantity. Osher Yadgar was there from SRI. Scott Davis was there. He's from NASA. Rick Arthur was there, and Rick worked at Apple. He was of the kind of second generation of Apple engineers to use Noble Ape, but now works at Google. And the interesting feedback that Rick gave, and I've editorialized this through BioLives in the past as well, was the idea that the Noble Ape simulation can actually provide the kind of structured information that even a company like Google would be interested in, and really flitted back to an idea that was initially presented by Pedro Ferreira in the, 2006 kind of time frame, in the idea of the various components of the Noble Ape simulation being autonomous communicating simulations and the ability to add data through these various components. And that was an idea that Pedro came up with in a 2006 time frame. It's quite ironic, CERN on one end and Google on the other in terms of this particular feature set. But so where was I? So Jeffrey Ventrella, Osher Yadgar, Scott Davis, Rick Arthur. 4 people attended the SRI talk, plus me. The trip in total cost me about $900, which thankfully my employer reimbursed me. But yeah, I don't know, it was a strange thing because it reminded me of what the Bay Area was like. I used to live there. I spent 18 months, 1999 through to 2001, in the Bay Area. It's not really a place for me anymore, I think. It was quite strange going back for a few days and just experiencing the standard, walking into a restaurant and having people talk loudly about their latest and favorite iPhone apps. And Apple really fundamentally has become a cell phone manufacturing company. And Intel, I guess, wants to be like that as well. And I just got the sense that this was a kind of shallow part of my former life in some regard, but also it gave me the sense that really developing remotely is the way to do these things. Not particularly good attendance to the talks, but then I got the sense that really when you release things in podcast form, you're putting it out there for an audience, a listening audience. So it occurred to me that the podcasts would probably reach more of the people who couldn't actually attend the talk on location, but still. So in the near future, there's going to be a release of the Noble Ape simulation, hopefully more utilization of the developer blog. I guess the real feedback from Apple was probably half a dozen different technologies that they'd like to see moving forward, but if this could be communicated in blog format, I guess it's superior to them than a general podcast format, and I can understand that. What else is news? Well, the SecondLife Client discussion has moved in a slightly different direction. I talked with Bruce Damer on the last BioLive last Friday night, and since then have been communicating with Justin. He has a double-barrel surname, which I'm going to forget. I want to say it's Casey Clark, but it's something like that. Anyway, he's the main developer of OpenSim, which is the SecondLife server, the open-source SecondLife server. And he's given some interesting food for thought. I mean, my anticipation is that one could generate a very thin client between something like the Noble Ape simulation and the SecondLife client, and he kind of gave that feedback. There seemed to be a few obvious problems associated with the idea that each individual Noble Ape as rendered would be a simulated agent, and that means that they would actually be a logged-in user in the OpenSim environment. For me, that's slightly problematic. It requires obviously multiple logins and a strange kind of interface interaction, which doesn't seem particularly intuitive. Similarly, there are elements of the dynamic landscape which are doable, and there are elements of the dynamic landscape which are not doable. It really begs the question if one should take aspects of the SecondLife client itself, strip out a good portion of these problems, and just create some kind of graphical client in Noble Ape simulation, which almost defeats the purpose of having a very distinct interface to the graphical render, because obviously it would become, Noble Ape simulation development source code if that client was stripped down and manipulated in some way. So, ongoing discussion, really. No code written as yet, but obviously the Bobbot from Noble Ape Web Server is a good part of the puzzle, a good piece of the puzzle. I think probably once the general modifications and maintenance are brought up to snuff and there's been a couple more releases of the simulation, the SecondLife client interface will be a hot topic. But like I say, that's probably going to come in a 3-4 months time frame. Certainly my short-term goals are finalising this chapter, getting a version of the simulation out, and just continuing what I'm doing on a number of other fronts. Obviously, Biota Live, this new podcast with Heron Stone, and other bits and pieces. I think the iPad version of Noble Ape simulation has been on the back burner recently, but that's something that needs to return to the hard simmer, so to speak. This has been, eclectic ape reality. If there is any other kind of ape reality, I'm probably yet to see it. But I wanted to give some kind of update to what was going on, and also some sense that I'm not dropping the Ape Reality feed altogether. I'm probably going to use it for slightly more productive piecemeal bits of information. But if you are interested in the Heron Stone collaborative podcast, you'll certainly hear more kind of eclectic directions from me than just the traditional artificial life simulation discussion that my podcasts have focused on to date, aside from model rail radio. So any topics, any questions, any ideas, the usual spiel here, tom@nobleape.com. I look forward to any listener feedback and general sense. If you'd like particular topics covered associated with the Noble Ape simulation, I know the recent SRI and Intel talks probably gave a pretty good general overview, although I've had kind of mixed feedback in terms of the level of listenership and level of interest associated with the points, but I wanted to cover as much as possible there. And I guess both in the Intel and the SRI talks, you, as listeners, may have heard slightly different perspectives given for the particular audiences. But anyway, once again, Tom Bartley in Las Vegas, Nevada, thank you very much for tuning into this podcast. Look forward to you tuning into the next podcast.